intro, Angel. Can people hear me okay?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'll just start with introducing our wonderful authors. First, we have Jenny Laden. Jenny is a visual artist, a writer, a teacher, an organizer, fundraiser, and mother. She studied studio art and art history at Barnard College and has an MFA from NYU. Her work has been exhibited in New York, Chicago, Washington, Richmond, Miami, Philadelphia, San Francisco, and Berlin. Jenny has worked as an art teacher, organized curriculum for collage, which here we are, collage, and taught AIDS awareness at numerous New York City high schools. Her first book, This Terrible True Thing, was published in fall of 2023 by Blackstone. Yay, welcome. And these are just some abbreviated bios because they both have done so many incredible things. But Alysia Abbott is the author of Fairyland, a memoir of my father, which was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and an ALA Stonewall Award winner. She grew up in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury, the only child of gay poet and writer Steve Abbott. Alysia is also a co-founder of the Recollectors Project, dedicated to remembering parents lost to AIDS and supporting the children they left behind. Welcome, Jenny and Alysia. So I thought we would kind of first just start off about talking about the overlaps of your work, kind of things that you both have in common, or kind of the shared experiences that both of your books talk about across genre and book fiction and nonfiction. And yeah, when I was reading both of your books, I was so struck by the kind of coming of age narrative that they both attend to, the role of dads in particular, and especially the timing of your stories during the height of the AIDS epidemic, and themes of grief and loss. I feel like are kind of the big overlaps I felt. But yeah, either you wanted to speak to those or me. Okay.
Obviously I read Alicia's book long before I even started writing mine. But Alysia and I met in 2001, or I remember, around there. And it was just after I had also met this whole community, and I didn't know that these slides are going to be a little funky because of the crown and anchor, but suspend disbelief. I only encountered collage when I was like the ripe old age of 30 or so, and I never felt the kind of belonging that I felt once I entered that world, and it like totally changed my life. So I just want everyone here to know that it means a lot to me, and we've been talking about like how amazing it would have been for us to have this kind of community growing up, to be raised in the 70s and 80s with a gay father was a bit of a lonely endeavor, and I think we have that in common. And then when we met, it was just like a kindred spirit, and to meet someone who had very different but very parallel sort of upbringings and experiences of also losing our dads at that time to that disease. So, mine's a fiction, but it's based on my story, and Alicia's is a memoir, so there's difference there. But I do think the way that when I was crafting my book, thinking about how do I tell a story that isn't just about a girl responding to her father having this disease, but tell the story of the disease as the context of a girl growing up and growing into political awareness, personal awareness, and kind of figuring out as an artist what kind of artist she wants to be. So that was sort of the trajectory I tried to build in my book. And I didn't have to use every little bit of factual story. I always say it was like I had a pantry of items that I could choose to use, and then I could tweak as needed for the book. So I think, obviously there's a lot of overlaps in our stories, but a lot of differences in how it happens.
You may be able to see the photos behind Jenny and her dad, and these are some stills from her book. Jenny is a graphic artist, beautiful, talented visual artist, does watercolor And so her book, what makes it unique and different from mine is that it's illustrated with her own drawings and characters, but and hers is a work of fiction. It's a YA book that's inspired by her experience growing up and losing her dad, and mine is a work of nonfiction. And it's illustrated also with drawings, but drawings that my father did, because my father was a cartoonist and visual artist. But when you do see the photos of Jenny and her dad, and then you also see photos of me and my dad, I think one of the things you will see that you really have in common was, this is my dad and I, is that we were very close with our fathers. And in my case, I lost my mom when I was 2.5 in a car accident, and so he suddenly was a single parent and moved us to San Francisco, now newly single to be a dad. And what inspired me to write my book, and I feel like, and this is one that ways that Jenny and I think our stories really connect, is that like I did feel so close with my father. I did feel he was my world, but also like I felt he was my person. You know, like he got me, I got him. And so the act of writing, 20 years after he died, was when I started working on it in earnest. It was like an act of returning to that relationship. And through the act of writing, this person becomes alive again. This place becomes alive again. The sense of like, did this even happen? Because at the time I was writing, I felt like we weren't talking about AIDS history. It was before, you know, Lee Jones' biography was made to a show. It was before, you know, like it was a time culturally when it was before How to Survive the Plague. It was a time culturally when there really wasn't very much media and television kind of acknowledging the AIDS epidemic and really much queer history. And so at the time, like a lot of times the memories were like, well, this is something I lived through, and I felt kind of lonely in that. Like, does anyone remember this the way I remember it? Because it was my dad. I mean, like if I had been a gay man in our community in my dad's era, I would have lost so many friends. And I lost my dad in this community, but then I moved and felt really detached from that community. So it was like, did that really happen? So the act of writing was an act of going back and recreating, of communing with that history, reading my dad's journals, going through the history books, being like, what did happen? And how did that happen? And how did our story intersect with history that I was at the time not even aware of? And so, but ultimately, a lot of that came down to, I miss this person, and I want to be with him again, and I want to make him feel alive to readers as he felt to me, so I could share him. And I know that Jenny, she has a different situation because her parents divorced, and she had a very close bond with her dad, so that loss was felt very personal.
Yeah, I agree that the act of writing was also a reconnection with him, and then imagining myself having conversations with him again and what it would be, and like if I could go back, you know, it was almost like this wish fulfillment. If you could go back in time and have the conversations with your dying parent, what would you say? You know, so there was some of that as well.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I think at least on our kind of like initial Zoom call, kind of like planning this event and talking, kind of thinking about what you're just saying about being kind of the keepers of a history, especially one that is not always told, and one that also from the perspective of queer spawn is rarely heard, let alone like make room for, kind of understood as its own thing. Like with both of you maybe speak to your experiences of like, I don't know, it's like the specificity of like articulating like the queer spawn part of the story and kind of just what it's been like to kind of, I don't know, both as authors and as people, like kind of, I don't know, kind of articulate that identity or kind of make it known even more as
It's really, really, I mean, I think it's very different. It's a different time now, it's a similar time now. We were talking before, day by day, of, you know, when we grew up in the 70s and 80s, you know, there was so much secrecy and isolation because it was a time where, you know, the levels of discrimination were so legal and, you know, was very high. So little too straight for the queer community. So, because within my dad's circle, there were just no other parents that were his friends. And so, by that I mean, I was sort of like often the only kid, and I like would draw all by myself or play by myself. And then when I was in my school environment, I was sort of discreet and felt like I couldn't say anything. And so, I felt it was important to kind of honor that history and describe that moment in time where I was like.
Yeah, my dad came out when I was 13 years old, so that was 1983. And he was not very, gregarious or flamboyant or so he kind of kept, it's not that he kept that to himself, he came out to me and my brother and to my mom, obviously, but it wasn't something that I needed to share with people, and so I would if it felt safe. Or if they were using language that I didn't like about gay people, I sort of play that card and to shock them and shut them the hell up. So I became like a little activist at 13 because I didn't want anyone to be speaking that way about gay people. But I didn't really, we were talking about this yesterday, when did I meet the first person that had gay parents? I think it was maybe after college. In college I had a friend whose grandfather was gay, which was very unusual. And then after college I met a few people. And then it was only because I was sitting in a burrito place in the Mission in San Francisco with my college ex-boyfriend who'd gone to high school with Alysia Rogers, who used to be the executive director of Collage. And they started chatting, and he said, "What are you doing now?" She said, "Oh, I'm the executive director of this organization for kids with gay parents." And I was like 30. I was like, "Wait, what? I'm one of them? You have an organization?" And she's like, "Wait, what? You're one of them?" And we instantly connected. And so like I said, entering that world and then meeting all these people. And then Alysia and I met through a writer who wrote a book called Families Like Mine, Abigail Garner. And so that was another way that network broadened out. But, it was quite late in my life. So I had spent a lot of time keeping that to myself and sharing it with people. And then, I had the same exact feeling like I'm too straight for the gay community, but I'm too gay for the straight community, and never quite feeling like I knew where I belonged. But I really felt this pull to want to hang out with my gay friends and go to gay clubs and go to gay bars. But then at the end of the day, the people that I was attracted to and wanted to date were not, so there was always this kind of feeling of being in two different worlds. That's why when I finally found the world of Collage, I was like, oh, this is okay. I get it. This is where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, thinking more about, kind of that experience of feeling sometimes made you feel like an outsider to your own community, or kind of, trying to figure out what world one belongs in. I think it's a very shared personal experience. I was wondering if you could speak maybe more, if you wanted to kind of, how your book has been maybe received in terms of what it's been like to write it and talk to a bunch of people about it. And I know this feels like a pretty special space. Being in Provincetown, being at Collage, being at Family Week is a pretty, it is a pretty singular place to be talking about personal books. So if there's anything in particular, either maybe wanted to impart to a very personal and heavy audience, or kind of thinking about Collage in this context, or kind of the first question was what it's been like to have the book in the world in terms of people's reactions to
was when my parents met before I was born. So they were sort of hippies in this time. It was very like queer, like poly before it was called poly. They had multiple partners, but it was this sort of idea of like, let's remake what relationships can be. But then it was pursuing a man who was involved in it, and that's how she got to this car accident, and then I thought it was a single dad. But, that idea of fluidness, fluidness of what a relationship could be, fluidness of what a family could be, of what a dad could be. A dad could be a mom, and a dad in a lot of ways is like my sibling best friend too. I felt like, there are ways I can feel, sometimes I'll feel almost like a jealousy for like younger collagers or younger correspondents. I'm like, well, you get to keep your mom and dad, or as I lost my mom and dad, I kind of have this identity, but as an orphan, this is one of his illustrated comic poems that he made. But I also feel like the experience of growing up with him as a model and living in San Francisco when we did, like kind of instilled in me an openness and tolerance for difference that I felt really set me apart and really helped me to be more fluid in the world. It was like I could see and feel really comfortable with people who were different in terms of gender representation, in terms of family makeup, like in lots of different ways because I grew up in this home, in this community, in this culture. So even though I felt like I lost when he died in '92, my direct tie to my passkey to the gay bars of the Castro where we used to hang out, I do feel like the experience of being a queer scholar was something that I internalized and that has been kind of a superpower for me in terms of just moving through the world. And this kind of, we said before how we felt sometimes between two worlds or where we didn't fit in, but in a way that can feel like a superpower because you can kind of fit in. It's like I knew and learned how to it wasn't good that I felt like I had to hide, but I also learned how to kind of be really attuned to like, how does this world work? How can I believe in this world? This was, my dad was a poet. This was one of his classes. So he says, what's a gay poem? A poem that sleeps with other poems? And this was back before the internet. You could, promote your classes. He would make these posters by hand, put them up in my laundromats and schools and all these spaces. But he was promoting gay and lesbian writing and like trying to lift up queer writers at a time that really was against the grain. That it wasn't easy to do, and it wasn't something that he did for his own. He would need to make money to survive, so he was offering his classes. But it was like he did that because he believed in it. It was important and powerful, and so we would do that sort of off time from his main work. I'm sort of answering your question while also narrating some of the stuff, but I'll pass it on to Jenny.
Yeah, I was thinking about the process of writing and then publishing is a whole other wax. So I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about that because it's not that fun. But what I do really love is this. I love talking to people and I love connecting and hearing questions, and I've now done a bunch of these things, but I was thinking about my book was intended to be read for a young adult audience because I decided early on to kind of make a mission for myself that I really wanted to tell the story of the AIDS epidemic to a younger generation who aren't experiencing it so that they can understand the cultural impact that has had on the generations before that, their parents, their grandparents, and I think it's an important part of our cultural history in general. And I just felt like, joining along with Alysia and all these other sort of recollectors and learning all these stories of people who lost their parents to AIDS, there's such a monolithic type of cultural story that we tell about AIDS and who got it and who suffered and who died and who grieved, which is not also realized that there are a lot of things I have to explain about life in 1991. Aside from homophobia and the way it was just so in every single fiber of every bit of the culture then, was also the technology, which is funny. So one of my early versions, I had a character that was the main character's boyfriend. He was like at college and she was still in boarding school, and they had a long-distance relationship, which in 1991 meant phone calls or visits. And so I had a bit in the thing how there was like a running thing where he'd call, like there'd be a note on her door, and then she'd have to call him back and then leave a message. And I had my agent had hired a reader who was like 18 as like a test reader, and she actually wrote. So I know there like wasn't Facebook or anything, but like there must have been a better way for them to get in touch. And it's really frustrating to read. I was like, girl. So this one it was like, but I was like, no, it's my responsibility to explain all of this, and so that's just like a funny example, but also explaining like the depth of homophobia, not just that our generation was living in, but the ones that our fathers had come up in, and why it was so terrifying for my dad to come out, you know, in the 50s as a teenager. He could not do that, and so, and even in the early 90s, you know, when I was in college, I had plenty of friends who later came out, but it was also a very terrifying time to come out because they were coming out into a very scary reality of the AIDS epidemic. And so not only was it terrifying for them to come out as gay in general and to be entering into that world. So I felt this responsibility to kind of explain all of that as best I could to a younger audience. So it's been interesting that a lot of people who read the book who are older will come up to me and they'll be like, my uncle or my cousin or my brother had AIDS and I could never talk about it to anyone. You know, and your book just brought so much up for me, and I'm so glad you wrote it. And like it was remarkable to me how many straight people read this book and knew somebody and had never processed that. Like had never even spoken aloud about it in all this time. You know, it's really something. So I felt like it also, it's kind of giving that permission for a lot of different people to understand the story better and to feel like seeing themselves in the story as well, which has been really gratifying for me.
Kind of maybe pivoting slightly, I was wondering if you could both maybe talk to us. So you had the experience of like how you might be keeping queerness alive in your own life right now as someone who's parent who was queer in the past, and so I know we talked a little bit about because your own experiences now as mothers and as like adults, and as people not maybe in the queer community firsthand, but obviously on a deep firsthand level too, and what that might mean for you.
Well, I have a queer daughter who's 18, almost 19, and it's been really wonderful just to have so much openness in our household. You know, like when she was very little, just to be like, not very little, she was younger. Is there anyone interested? Anyone? You know, just being like, you know, who's cute? Like, you know, I'm kind of curious where she's headed and how open, you know, she has a girlfriend now, but like just sort of feeling that she, you know, that we just have a really welcoming space, but also I think I personally am really interested in, and continue to be interested in stories by queer writers. So the books I read, the books I teach, and you know, the stories I'm interested in, like it's so funny. I don't know if any of you know Andrew Solomon. He did a passion, interest, curiosity, sense of comfort in queer history and queer cultural history. And some of that's because that's what I was raised in, and it's what was valuable to him. But it's very funny because I'm like, do I have a right to inherit this? Like, is this my culture? Like, I grew up with, like, I think Abigail Barner, who wrote that book, Families Like Mine, talked about, like, being, like, sexually straight, culturally queer, right? And so I'll feel sometimes like I'm much more at ease in a queer space than I am in a, like, a football game or something, or like, or it's like, I was a grown up when I was like, so what does a homecoming mean? I don't even understand. And my cousin's like, you don't know what a homecoming is? I'm like, no, I have no idea what that is. Like, people come home? I'm like, what does that mean, a homecoming? And I hadn't had it, like, explained to me, because it was just not what I grew up in. And so I, you know, I'll try to, I'll keep maybe some aspect of that alive. And definitely the act of remembering someone, like having pictures and being like, and this was someone who, like, when my daughter was, like 11 or 12, I took her to go see John Waters speak and you know, meet him. And I was 11 or 12. I mean, too young, but my dad took me to see Polyester, the movie, and it was like in Scratch and Sniff. That was like you have this like script, and you would like scratch. There'd be a number that would flash on the screen. You'd scratch, and it would be like stinky sneakers or roses, and I was a kid being like, this is so weird, but it was also like campy, like and fun, and so it was really important to me that like I'm going to take my daughter to go see John Waters, and now I've since, like, you know, John Waters is kind of, he calls himself a filth elder, you know, and he's a queer elder, but like, it's really because my daughter doesn't have a grandfather in her life to kind of be her queer elder or filth elder. I feel like I've sort of looked to John Waters and other men and people in my life who can kind of fill that role to be like, this is where you come from too, and these are values that, like, I'm proud to come from, you know, this, I do see it as a heritage, in a way,
Yeah, I was telling you this story. I mean, yes, all of the above, of a lot of what Alysia said, and kind of keeping in touch, and when you have a dead parent, when you're having a child, and you have to figure out how to weave that parent into their history, so that, like, this was a person that you came from and means a lot to me, and I want you to know them. And I remember talking to my daughter and saying, you know, trying to explain that I had a father, and my daughter doesn't have a father, so I'm a single mother by choice, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, because it's also related. But I would say, like, you know, he died, and she tried to understand what that meant, and people couldn't believe I was trying to explain death to my 3-year-old, and I was like, well, it's not coming, like, you're going to have to explain it sometime. And then one time she said, but if he's not here, where is he? And I was like, he's up in the sky. Like, he's just everywhere and all over. And she said, what floor is he on? So I was like, it's really far out. You know. I was like, 278? And she's like, oh, that's really bad. But going back, I worked for Family Week for 4 summers, and from 2001 to 2005-ish. And maybe my second or third summer, I was getting up there, right? So I was like 32, and all my friends were coupling up, and you know, if they were coupling up, they were having babies or thinking about it or talking about it. And I always knew I wanted to have a kid, but I hadn't found a partner. And I was hanging out at Family Week, and I was hanging out with these moms who were probably not much older than me, and I was holding one of them, an old baby, and they were letting me hold the baby, and I was bouncing the baby on my knee. And she looks over and she's like, you want to have a kid, right? And I was like, yeah, I do. And she said, do you have a partner? I was like, no, I'm single at the moment. I'm looking. And she's like, well, all you need is a credit card. And I was like, yes. Tell me more about this credit card conception. And so she told me her whole story, and I had heard a million of these stories because I was leading all these kids' workshops, and you know, we created one called What's Your Story that let every kid tell the story of how they got to be in their family. And me her whole story, and how they brought the tank and they brought it to the house. And she's like, "Oh, I had a friend that did it, doctor's office." And I think because of my experience having a gay father and kind of living outside of this like singular norm, way of being, when it came time for me to think about creating my own family, I didn't feel so penned in, right? I didn't feel like, well, I have to wait for the guy. If he doesn't come, I gotta settle for some other guy. And I wasn't gonna settle for some guy. I didn't want to go through a divorce. I didn't want to do any of that. And then I discovered credit card games. So then I started to think more about it, and I gave myself till I was 36. And on my 36th birthday, I was like, well, I guess we'll call him the doctor. And I called the doctor, and then like the next week, I got, everything was good to go, and then I started ordering sperm, and now I have a child who's probably gonna walk into here any minute because she's late, and she's about to turn 17, and she was born in the middle of family week. So, yeah. So part of how I made my family was very much informed by, my queer spawnness, and just seeing that like there are a million ways to do that and to create family and to live your life. And so even though I'm, identify as straight, I don't feel like the singularity of that as much as maybe some people who hadn't had that kind of experience. So, thanks, Family Week.
Yeah, and that was like so connected to kind of what we were talking about before, like kind of like the superpower of being queer spawn, like this openness, this fluidness that so many of us are kind of just raised in. That feels like, to move between
That's why this needed, shape shift is needed, but like also just a high emotional intelligence.
Yeah, and also thinking about how even like John Waters coming up, or like your daughter being born during family week, like we're in Provincetown. I know for both of you, like place is important, and the importance of place. Like I don't know if either of you want to speak to like Provincetown as a site that is meaningful to you, or the other places.
Yeah, so my family, before my parents split up, every summer we came to Wellfleet and rented a house on Gold Pond. And at least 2 or 3 times a summer we come up to P-Town and walk up and down. And we were just talking about this, like before rainbows meant gay pride, there were just these rainbow stores. Well, maybe there was a connection early on, but I feel like that connection happened later. But this was like 1975-ish. And there was a store towards the east end of Commercial Street, and they had these mobiles there were like satin pillows with like rainbow colored, ribbons. And I had like a collection of them on my ceiling at home. And so every summer that's what I would wait for. I'd be like, we're going to Sarah's house, and then we're kind of going to get a rainbow mobile. That's all I cared about. But then also I think it was my introduction to gay culture. In many ways, because I would just see all these incredible people walking up and down that did not look like my parents' friends. And then year after year after year, as I got older, seeing that. So it's a really special place. And actually, when my father died, I ended up scattering his ashes in Wellfleet, both at the beach and at Gold Pond. So every time I come back here, there's like this resonance or a feeling of connecting with him. Just really nice.
I didn't actually come to Provincetown. First time I came to Provincetown and Cape was 2010, because that's when I moved to Massachusetts. Because I was raised in San Francisco, so I just never made it out to this far east. But I should say, because I was raised by a single gay dad from the age of 3 on, I just was very, most often in spaces that were poetry spaces, because he was a poet and doing readings, or in spaces of the Castro and Wall Street and Haight Ashbury. So it was sort of generally very queer bohemian. And San Francisco, since that era, has changed tremendously. I mean, as you all know, like because of the dot-com boom and just various other, it's just sort of harder to find. Like when I do return to San Francisco, I just like to go walk into Golden Gate Park and smell the eucalyptus, or go out to Ocean Beach. Those are the parts that feel unchanged to me. And I try to just find where it feels like the way I remember. So much is different. But the first time I came to Provincetown, I was like, this sounds very familiar. And this just feels very good. I felt very comfortable and at ease. Like I liked, I liked how there's something so unique about the size of Provincetown. And I also just feel like, I admire the degree to which the town supports, like, Fine Arts Work Center and PAM and Provincetown Playhouse, like the arts, like it's just, I felt like there's a really an urge, a need, a passion for people to protect what Provincetown is. I mean, granted, it is very expensive who can buy here, who can vacation here. There are issues about like who may be forced out or how do we make space for everyone. But even like especially I feel like when I've been here in the off season, which is kind of my favorite season, it's like I saw Provincetown with their makeup off. Like I love that Provincetown. But there's still like a sense of like artists and townies and fishermen and and different people that mix here that feels very special to me. And my ability to come back here, because this has been like the closest I felt to coming back to San Francisco that I remember. And so I feel, and, aside from the beautiful light and aside from like, I also have taught at the Fine Arts Work Center and I love just the way this place inspires writers of all types and has for over, for 100 years. So I feel a deep connection with it now. And I live, then I relocate. I live in the Boston area, so this is where I've been coming every summer since 2010. So it's also a place where my daughter has had her birthday, and I've gotten her Pride T-shirts, and we almost got her first tattoo here, but she actually has her tattoo now. She had to turn 18. They didn't let her do it with me there. She doesn't get how what a radical queer parent I am. But yeah, anyway, yeah.
I will say also my book starts and ends in Cape Cod, and there's a very really a scene that's beloved to me. It's a flashback scene that takes place in Provincetown, so check that out.
I have maybe like one more question or so.
We just take questions from the audience. I mean, if that's, we're also happy to read from the book, but I really feel like this is a community space. Like being here for Family Week and with Queer Spawning Queer Parents, like, is, it's an honor, it's very special, but I feel like this is like, for us, like the act of writing, you do it alone, but the act of writing is like opening a conversation. You're in conversation with readers, you hope your book will contribute to a conversation, and so I feel like the book comes alive in conversation, so I think if we can take questions from you and sort of that we would be very happy.
I think, yeah, as we maybe transition to that. Oh, there's a hand. Let's look at that.
I'm wondering how your upbringings influenced your path to becoming writers. Like, why that? Why not somewhere else?
Would you repeat the question on mic, please?
Oh, yeah. So the question is, I'm wondering how your upbringing has contributed to your paths. Like, how did you become writers?
Well, I had a lot of other outlets before I got to writing. So from the time I was 9, I wanted to be an artist, and my dad was always very encouraging. Throw all sort of realism to the wind, and like, yes, you should absolutely do that. And my mother's like, what are you talking about? Well, how are you gonna make money? So I pursued that for a long, long time, and studied painting and other visual art. But in about 10 years ago, a friend of mine reached out and asked if I would want to write a children's book. And I took a stab at it, and I wrote a really sweet story, but nobody bought it. And then he's like, I think you should write a book about your dad, like for young adults. And I was like, I can't write a book. What are you talking about? I can't. And he just started sending me
Beautiful visual artist. Can I just remind you, she's a visual artist.
No, my drawings, maybe.
Okay, she wasn't just like the boring jobs. Like, she's an incredible artist.
Yeah, So I think that as an artist, I've always loved to create and to make things that weren't there before. Like that was always a thrill to me. But then this kind of dare of like, could I learn a whole new art form? And I always wrote for myself. So writing was like a very personal, intimate, private thing. Maybe I'd read it to a friend or send like a love poem to, someone I had a crush on, but I wasn't like, I want to be a published author. That wasn't really my pursuit. But when I kind of this was proposed to me, I thought it would be a really interesting thing. And I think by then I did feel such an urge to share the story with the world as a way of telling its history. And like I said, that mission was very meaningful to me. And so my friend Kevin just started sending me books about writing. He said, you can do it, here, just, like a drug pusher, like here, just try this little thing, just read this little thing. And so I spent like 6.5 years writing the book, and I wrote like 3 different versions of it. But it was also like climbing this mountain of learning an art form. But I think when you've already learned an art form, whether it's dance or music or visual art, you understand some inherent things that are just universally about that kind of process. And for me, one of those is I just need to kind of understand some of the rules so then I can mess around with them and play. But if I don't know what the rules are, I'm like lost out there on the field. So understanding narrative arcs and understanding like the cadence and rhythm. For me, the hardest part was actually being able to see, not being able to see everything at once. Because as a painter, you can work, and then you can stand back and your eyes can kind of take it all in, but you can't do that with a book. And finally, at a certain point, I was able to put every chapter up on a wall with little 3x5 cards with like all the different things going on, the characters, and then I could sort of see it and be like, oh, that character's here, but they don't show up until like 12 million chapters later, but there's just something about that, like the ways that you have to kind of adjust and change and shift it. Is a very different process, but I loved learning it, and it was, for me, kind of a thrill to learn a new art form as an artist. It felt very comfortable with one column, and then to be able to write a book about being an artist, which is what it really is about in many ways, because the main character wants to be an artist when she is an adult, and then to bring in all the images was also like a way to weave in the things that I was. In fact, I wrote the book and I'm like, aren't you going to do the drawings? I'm like, the drawings. That's the easy part for me. Like, that's going to be a cinch. And so I'd written a whole book, and I think when we sold it, I had made about 8 drawings. And in the end, there's 59 drawings. So then I had to go through the manuscript and be like, oh, that'd be a good drawing. Okay. We didn't already show the drawing. Like, oh, okay, that'll be up to a sell. And so then I began to build up this list. But I didn't, I didn't grow up thinking I'd be a writer. But I always wanted to be an artist. And for me, it's the same, deep down, it's the same process. It's just a different material. And there's a kind of a different rhythm, obviously, when you're writing a book. And reading, as the audience or the reader, you're reading a book from the first page to the last page. As an artist, you don't have that kind of control over the linearness of how someone's taking it in, unless it's a film or something like that, where there's a time frame. So those are just some of the things that were really different for me, but really it was thrilling to learn how to write and to learn all the structure and then to see the structure. Like every time I read a book now or watch a film, like I can see the skeletons inside of it that I never, as a non-writer, knew were there. I was just kind of receiving, going along the ride, which you're meant to do as the reader. But it was kind of fun to start to see that stuff, the structure underneath it.
So I mentioned before my father was a writer, as a poet, and he also wrote criticism and essays for papers. So published some books. But after he died, because I was orphaned pretty young, I really didn't think I should pursue any artistic. Wasn't thinking like I need to pursue an artistic field because I wanted some stability, and I also grew up without a lot of stability because he was a single dad. And so initially, for many years, I was like real job, with benefits that were sort of creative related. Like I worked start this on tape. It doesn't exist anymore. But I always had my father's journals, and I would, and when I was little, he really encouraged me to draw, and really encouraged me to write, and even in my letters, he would send that I was sent him when I was in college, he would say, "You really have a writer's map for capturing kind of detail, smell, like you should go cover these riots that are happening as part of France. You should go there and do a story for it." And I'm like, I'm 20 years old. I don't know what you're talking about. But I wonder also at that point, he was writing me in college, and he knew he had AIDS. He knew he was dying. He didn't know when. At that time, it was before protease inhibitors. And I think in some ways, he was nurturing and actively parenting and encouraging me while he could. Be like, you might want stability, but you really have, you should do this. And he'd write to me like, I hope you one day experience the pleasure of having your books for you. See that books for me with you. Like, I really want that for you. And the way that he would encourage me was a way that like your parent would be like, ooh, a very nice voice. I'd be like, oh, it's so embarrassing. Don't look at me. I couldn't appreciate that, the way that he was like trying to see in me the future self I would be, but he did, and it's very strange because it took me a long time to write the book, but in writing the book, I got to have his work published in French, which was a country, he always wanted to live in France and get to have his work read there, and have this book and have people know and share him in a way that he never, it's sort of strange to be having this, like he planted seeds which are now finally, these decades later, being harvested. And I taught a class through the Fine Arts Work Center the other week about how writing is a form of kind of communicating with the dead, like bringing the act of remembering and writing, remembering and writing, is like going down to the underworld, taking the secrets and treasures and coming back up to the surface and sharing them. And it's treacherous. The trip to the underworld can be treacherous. You don't want to get stuck down there. You need to have a way to pull yourself back. Like to revisit your past and your most painful memories can be heavy. Like you think you've healed and you know all that, and you go back and like, gee, I was an asshole then. I didn't even realize. Like you really look at your life through a different lens. But the fact that my dad was a writer and had so many materials that outlived him, that where his voice outlived him, it felt like an opportunity to work with that material and bring some part of it back. And it felt like it was actually what he wanted, because he always wanted to write about us, and he never finished that. So it was like I could sort of finish it. And so there were some aspects of my relationship with him working on this project where, I don't know if you're familiar with MC Escher, but there's like one of his famous drawings is a hand drawing a hand. And you're like, which hand is drawing which hand? Like, who's the author? And like, in some ways, the parent is the author of the child. And then the child takes on a life of their own. And here I was getting the kind of author of my dad. And so it like my upbringing with him, not necessarily that he was a queer dad, but like him being a writer, but that, it definitely influenced me. And that he kind of pushed me subtly in that direction.
Are there other questions in the audience? Yeah, up front.
When your books are read by people who are not part of this community, what are the conversations that arise?
I'll just repeat the question real quick in case anyone didn't hear. But when your books are read by heteronormative folks and not people, particularly in this room, like what has it been like to be received by them?
Well, I was very nervous actually the first time that I was working on the book, because resources that were available, and his kind of optimism, sort of a little naivete about like how much I can handle as a kid. And I was really afraid that it would make like that people would judge your parents by how I portrayed my dad. And I need to show him it's like it's really great dad, really responsible all the time. And that's not who he was. And I need to be honest about that. But I also felt like, why should, like, there's so many memoirs with straight parents who are alcoholics and not really great, or having affairs and having great parents, and no one's like, look at what straight parents do. So I didn't feel like it was fair, that my dad, like, how I described him shouldn't have to be representative of a whole community. And I shouldn't have to, like, shape him into a model that wasn't truthful. Like, I know that he raised me the opposite of how he was raised, and that for him was to be as loving and open as possible. But sometimes it was to give me a little bit more independence than I was ready to handle, or exposing me to some stuff that I was not always ready to handle. But like I could understand, and that was what the act of writing does, is you like have to look at your characters with understanding and compassion. It's not like someone just in your life. Like, you have to make someone come alive on the page, you have to make them a character on the ground. You have to kind of understand what motivates them. And for me to understand what motivates my dad was like, access to his journals, but also access to the kind of culture he came up in and what he was reacting to. So I try to really look at like, what was he trying to do? But so there were some times when folks would say, like, I don't know who is more selfish, the father or the daughter. Like when my book first came out in 2013, it was in the era of open comments. Now people don't let, comments are not really as free form on the web as they were. But at that time it was like, we just want to get as many comments as possible. What do you think? What do you think? And people were just jerks, and they're like, this person sounds like a terrible. And I was reading this and I just came to realize with readers, people bring their own history to us, if they're just listening to an interview with me on the radio, or they're just reading a 900-word article I've written, they don't know me. They don't know my dad. They're sort of maybe forming opinions based on this small snippet of story, but often it reflects their own, what they bring to it. And I had to come to, in the act of writing and sharing something so real and personal, where I felt like, I'm being really honest about my dad. He's not here to defend himself. I wanna care for him. I wanna be honest, but I wanna care for him, and I want to care for the community, but I came to learn, like, I don't have to pay attention. How are people responding, and how, like, I've had a lot of people who are heteronormative just be like, I was raised by a single parent, and your book spoke to me so much. What it was like to have a single parent dating different people, or what it was like to have a parent, a Bohemian parent in the 70s and 80s. These other ways that intersected with my dad's identity, and I was just like, ultimately, it's a parent-child story. It's a parent-child relationship.
Yeah, I would say people really seem to respond to the daughter-father relationship, and sort of, and also losing a parent. That there's a lot of I get a lot of that kind of feedback of just how beautiful the story is, of that what their connection is, and the fact that he's gay doesn't really seem to even enter their. It's not part of how they're kind of receiving the story. It's a backdrop, which is kind of lovely. And also, like I said earlier, there's a lot of people who come up to me who had themselves personal connections to AIDS, and having lost people to AIDS who've never come in to even talk about it. And so I think it's giving that kind of open, like, invitation.
Open the door.
Right.
Yeah, the book allows people to see themselves in it and maybe connect with feelings that they didn't were otherwise able to connect.
Right, and I've never been able to talk about it even. When I was first writing the book, one of my best friends who's gay said to me, do you feel weird about like telling that story? It's really a gay story. And I was like, babe, it's my story. Like, it's also my story. Like, you do know, you understand that, right? He's like, well, yeah, but it's not. I was like, yeah, but it's not a story about being gay. It's a story about a girl and her father and a disease, and like that's an element to it. But like the gay world doesn't own AIDS. Like the
Well, yeah, and that it comes up with these questions of who's allowed to tell that stories, and am I part of this community? Like, what made, like, I haven't lost, like, I would feel that way, like, I haven't lost as many personal relationships as I have some of the other people I interviewed for this book or that I spoke with, and like, who I have a right to talk about this loss. But I lost my dad, and I lost it. And he was my everything, and this is my perspective on that. It's like not saying like this is the definitive history or the definitive, like not making claims to try to speak outside my experience, but what I think sometimes you can do is like, here I'm sharing my experience, we're also complicating that history. Meaning, like, a lot of people don't think of AIDS history as a family story, that it affected so many families too, and it did. And you don't hear about that because a lot of times those families, unfortunately, learn this through the Recollectors Project, those kids were told they had to be completely secret, they could not say what happened. Or they themselves were lied to, told that their parent died of cancer, and didn't find out until years later that their parent died of AIDS. And there was so much stigma around it that they're like, we can't talk. And so those people were just disconnected, and those stories weren't being heard. And so it's not saying like, this is the more important story, or this is where we can speak on this history as authorities, but this is an aspect of the history that is also part of the history that can complicate the narrative. Just saying like all the different ways that AIDS impacted people across the country.
Yeah, I had women come up to me at an event I did outside of Philadelphia with on high school with, and they were like, I had no idea that you went through any of this. Like I didn't know. Because they didn't know, either we weren't close enough or never talked about it. So I think it is opening up that kind of opportunity to share the history from all those different angles, which is kind of cool.
Sure. I just was wondering about the choice to fictionalize or not your stories, and now that your book has been made into a movie, if there were fictionalizations that you had to choose or had any part in there, and also just the choice to write a memoir versus a narrative.
Yeah, I think because I started out mine as a way to tell a story to a younger generation, I just out of the gate, I was like, well, I guess I'll write a novel rather than a memoir because I wanted it to be a story. And then I needed to already had to start tweaking things immediately. Like the main characters in young adult novels tend to be young adults, which means they're between like 15 and 21. So I was like, all right, so now she's 17. And I was 25 when my dad died, so how do I, and then pacing, like from the time I found out my dad was positive to when he died was 5 years. But I told my story this story in 7 months. So like just a lot of technical things like that kind of were required to keep the book like a good pace to read. And then just little things like that. So I think early on, and I didn't even entertain the idea of doing memoir. I think partly because there's still people in that story that are around that may not like the way I'm telling it. And that's the reality of it. But also, I wanted it to be. I wanted to kind of make something that a young reader would really want to like bite into and eat up, really and digest, like delicious. And I wanted to kind of craft something. And I also the books that Kevin was sending were not about memoirs; they were about writing books. So yeah. So early on, I kind of just made that decision, and then it gave me a lot of leeway to. I mean, there's lots of leeway in memoir as well, obviously, but I was able to kind of shape-shift it over the course of writing it to make it the story that made the most sense for itself.
So I wrote it as a memoir because I had these materials, and I don't know, I just felt like that's always the medium I'm manipulate, like with interviews, research, interviewing, like I wanted to make it feel very alive, the scene of my mother's funeral. I was, you know, a 2-year-old at that scene. I can't remember that. But I could interview my uncle and get his memories and say what he remembers. I can look at my dad's journals. And so I would kind of reconstruct scenes. But always having the reader know that it was me telling the story and why I wanted to tell the story. And I was the true thing, you know, through the whole work. But that changes when, so the book was made into a movie. It showed at the Provincetown Film Festival summer of last year, which was really great. And it was very interesting because the filmmaker was produced by Sophia Coppola, the director was a good friend of hers named Andrew Durham. And he lost his dad to AIDS the same year I lost mine in 1992. He was also a gay man. And so he had access, like he could both remember what it was like to be a child and have a dying parent in that time where you just want to be a kid and not have to think about difficult stuff. And he also knows what it's like to be a single gay man looking for love, which was a big part of my dad's story. And so it was really interesting, you know, a lot of scenes were taken right out of my book. But the scene that got me most when I watched the film, the one that, like, the first time I watched it, the one that made me cry, was a scene that was not from my book. It was a scene that I'm not present for. So I wouldn't have been able to remember it. It was a scene of my dad in a bar, like trying to pick someone up, you know, like looking around and trying to meet someone. And I saw so much vulnerability in the actor playing my dad, that it's really interesting because, like, when you write a book and a memoir, you go through so many edits, and you're rewriting the same scenes, or maybe the book has been out, like mine has for a while, so I've read from it many times, and like, yes, I know this is what happens here, and here's the story, and here's how I tell it. And in some ways, like, your grief is like, you know, a well-trod path in the woods. Like, you walked it millions of times. You don't even have to think about it. You're just walking and you know exactly where to go. But here, having someone else interpret the book, you know, having someone who took the source material but brought their own history to it, their own take, and there was sort of a defamiliarization of the story, right? So there's elements where, like, that's an actual picture of my mother in that scene. That is not my grandmother's kitchen. You know, so there would be this sort of uncanny stuff, but it was almost like this back path to my grief that I had never walked. It was still very rough, and like I walk and like I feel, you know, the branches scratching against my legs and arms because no one had ever walked it before. And it was like, oh my God, I still have all this grief I didn't even know I had. Like I thought that I knew. I can't believe that I still feel all this. Because I had just practiced, in some ways, the story and writing it and telling it for many years, and I got to feel it anew. And it was that scene that I didn't write, you know. So it was like the thing about when you lose someone and they're gone, like you have this set of photographs or this set of letters, and you kind of just have that, and you reread and relook at those things over and over, but they're pretty static. But then what does it, you know, happen when you kind of suddenly see a film of them that you've never seen, or an audio recording, and you're like, they surprised you. And that's what the living do, right? They're alive because someone can still surprise you, and you're not contained. And so it was like, that was really, really cool to watch someone else take something like fictionalize, like create a scene that is a fiction scene, but make it feel so emotionally alive for me in a way more than my nonfiction, which is so, you know, warm from use in my memory, you know?
I wanted to add one thing about the process in my book. As I was writing, my friend Kevin, who's my agent, said, you should have a scene where she like does something with ACT UP. She should do an ACT UP thing. You know, that should be part of the story. And I said, yeah, but I wouldn't do that. And I felt really uncomfortable just like inserting it in there and pretending. And I wrestled with it because I didn't want to tell the story without mentioning ACT UP because there was such an enormous history, but I also didn't want to fake it. 'Cause I wanted to do it justice, so to speak. But through my correspondent community, I was able to find someone who actually did, and she had spent years working with ACT UP. And so I got her on the phone, and I said, here's what I'm doing, and I'm writing this book, but I really want to put something in about ACT UP. Can you answer some, can I ask you some questions? And so the way that I brought it into the story was that there's a character who's a friend of the father's who is fully with ACT UP, a full-time activist, and he brings her to a meeting, and then they go to an action. So she's a visitor, and I felt like, okay, I can tell that story because I went to plenty of marches and plenty of protests, but I didn't work with ACT UP, and it wasn't, I wasn't in that world as much, but I wanted to bring it into the story, so that was kind of a way that I could do that without sort of feeling like a phony.
Towards the end, I don't know if there's one more question or, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories. I really 100% to everything you shared. I had a big brother who, I was born in the 70s also. In the 80s, I was from age 12, I lived a beautiful life. Then age 12, I realized how the association of shooting relative hatred towards being gay, and I silenced myself and lived all those secrets. And when my dad was HIV positive again, that was another very isolating period. And his partner died very quickly after being diagnosed. My father didn't take medication, so we were doing father. But I was curious to know if the HIV diagnosis changed your relationship with me. When my father was diagnosed, I really felt like I was living a long time. It was a death sentence. I had to get all these things in it. I wanted so much to make my grandfather, and I wanted to invite my children to experience, and I did that. So I wanted to know that diagnosis changed or sped up some of the relationships that wasn't
Yeah, I found out my dad was positive when I was in the middle of college. And I guess, I think I just stopped fighting with them about anything. It's like, we don't have time for this. I don't have, and I didn't know how much time we would have then because he wasn't sick yet. And so I think it gave me an appreciation of having the time that I had with him, and then also just trying to navigate that uncertainty, just not knowing, is he going to live to 80 or is he going to live for 2 more years? And he didn't want me to put my life on hold and my brother to put our lives on hold in any way for him. And he didn't even want to tell us at first. He didn't tell us for about 2 years. And then he lost a friend who we hadn't known was positive. And he was really angry at that friend for not having shared that. And then he realized, oh, this is what I'm doing to my children also. So he told us. But I think it made everything a little softer between us, and him a little more, in the moment maybe than he'd been before that. But yeah, it was hard, and my parents still didn't really talk to each other, so there was a lot of emotional navigation that went on there. And, and then when he, really began to get sick, our relationship took on a different sort of structure, and it was sort of me trying to, at a very young age, navigate hospitals and doctors and medicine and support and all of those things.
Alyssia is here. Welcome, Luci. Next generation. I don't remember finding out when my dad converted, which is sort of a funny thing to not remember. I remember when I knew he wasn't HIV positive, and I And then when I was away in college, we wrote each other letters, because that was before email, before FaceTime, everything was so much harder. And so I was at New York, NYU, and then I lived a year in France. And so the letters track when he was telling me about his T-cell count in Poland. And he asked me he wanted me to graduate early so I could move home and take care of him. And because he was communicating via letters, it was very distant and distracted. I don't really know the difference between age-related condition versus just being HIV positive. And, like they're just sort of different stages that were just very
Google it.
Yeah, I couldn't Google it, and I didn't know who to ask. I didn't know who to ask. And so, but when he came out to visit me in France, to say I'm going to need you to be home. And so I graduated college early. I moved home to live with him in our pediatric apartment for the last year of his life about. And so I think that it was something that was a lot of tension because I was like, oh, I think I want to stay in New York a little bit longer. I have this internship, this really great internship. It's like, these letters increasingly are like, New York is great, and I'm really glad you like it, but New York will be there in a year, and I may not like it. It was that direct in the letters. And what's really remarkable, and why I was like living that kind of letters, is that I have those, right? Like as evidence of what our community, like if it was email or text, it just be lost. And so I moved back, and I just was really glad. I mean, it could be tense at times because I was living with him, and I was like, I just became busier than ever because I needed to feel alive. I didn't know how long I would be a caregiver when I was 21 years old, and I was like, I'm going to work at this radio station, I have this job, and I'm just gonna. I was just busy, but also taking care of him. But I think I felt like in the end just so glad to have this intimacy, like that it was a gift. I mean, as hard as it was, as much as I could be like, I can't believe I'm doing this alone. Like, I had a lot of friends that helped, and there were a lot of amazing groups, like the Shanti Project, and a lot of different age groups that were available to help. But in a way, I was like the only child who grew up with him, who felt really jealous of his boyfriends or jealous of the poetry readings. He's like, it's me. I get to have him, like, as much as it was hard, I was like, I want to be the one to take care of him. I want to be making these decisions. And so that I felt this real closeness with him. And making, and we were, again, it was very much surrounded by community, like even in his last, hour in the hospice, he was surrounded by, friends, former roommate, poets, other friends, and I was there too. So it was like we were all there together. But yeah, I still felt this privileged position, like I'm the daughter. I'm the only family, because he just not as close to his extended family because they were like, uptight Catholic, didn't really, they didn't outright reject him, but he didn't feel safe. They didn't feel close with them. And so, but it in some ways it brought us, I think, closer. And as much as I am sad to have lost him, and I feel so lucky to have had him. I feel like that was the gift. Like I got closer to him in our 21, almost 22 years together than some of my friends are with their parents who are still alive today. It's sort of like, it's the quality of time, not the quantity of time, right?
Well, I feel lucky having gotten to hear from both of you and to have had this event. I think we're kind of coming to the end of our time, so I just want to thank both authors so much. And there will be a book signing. You can purchase the books. And thank you to East End Books for